Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. As we were earlier this week, we're focusing on the relationship between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, the rise and fall of that relationship in the light of a two-part documentary made by Firecrest Films for BBC Scotland. And those of you who listened to our first episode on this subject will recall that Bernard acted as a consultant to the series. So we just want to reiterate that to act as disclosure, if you like. And I also had a couple of meetings with the series director and producer, and my sister was an assistant producer on the program, so that we are not involved in the actual making of the programs or their editorial choices and content, but we did play a small part in the creation of these programs. So, Bernard, we talked a lot in the last episode about the rise of the SNP to power. And the second episode is more concerned with Alex Salmond's return as leader, then the referendum. Then Nicola Sturgeon takes over, and we have the decline, the destruction of the relationship between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. What do you think were the most interesting aspects of the second episode?
I think the very, very first clip, or one of the first clips in episode 2, in a sense sets the tone for the rest of the 1 hour, where Alex Salmond says loyalty might not be everything in politics, but it's almost everything in politics. And of course, as the program unfolds, the sense that you get, and the sense that you get from those who are sympathetic to Alex Salmond, is that whilst Alex Salmond, as First Minister, had shown Nicola Sturgeon loyalty, one will remember that when she was Deputy First Minister, that she had written effectively a reference to a court for a criminal, which was very, very problematic for her at the time. But Salmond backed her 100%. And one of the themes that you get is people who are talking about Alex Salmond's management style, and they're saying he's a tough taskmaster. He can be really very, very bullish, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of it, and he'll tear strips off you. That was one of the things. Jeff Aberdeen, as former chief of staff, at one point in the programme said, I was fired 7 times, but I was always expected at my desk the following day. So there is this theme which is running, which is that he can be very, very difficult with you. Linda Fabiani actually tells the programmes that a few times after dealing with Mr. Salmond, she was in tears, but he would always come back and make up. So there's this view that he's very, very tough, perhaps oversteps the line, maybe perhaps even quite considerably. But at the end of the day, he will always be loyal to you. He'll throw himself in front of the bus rather than have the bus hit you. And clearly the underlying theme from Mr. Salmond's supporters is that degree of loyalty, which Alex Salmond says right at the top of the programme is almost everything. The clear implication was that when it came to loyalty, Nicola Sturgeon had abandoned him, despite the fact he would consider that much, if not all of her career, she owed to him.
Absolutely. I mean, the SNP, and we have repeated references to this from many participants throughout the programme. The SNP likes to think of itself as a family. It's not a normal political party, not a conventional political party. And watching this, I couldn't help but feel, well, okay, it's a family and so on. Here's Salmond as the sort of mob boss, if you like, demanding absolute loyalty, and then being puzzled when he is no longer head of the family. And he seems somewhat astonished that Nicola Sturgeon isn't asking for his advice, that Nicola Sturgeon is essentially ignoring him. It's difficult to avoid the suspicion that when she's touring Scotland, she's filling the Hydro in Glasgow with 12,000 SNP supporters. Nicola, the rock star, taking the SNP to heights unknown previously. Nicola having a bigger influence or being more highly esteemed in London than Salmond ever was, which is something that is actually more important to SNP leaders than they might care to admit. They like the big stage, and Nicola had a voice on that big stage, particularly after the Brexit referendum, that Salmond never quite achieved. So I think you could see all sorts of rivalries and ego, frankly, coming to the surface here. I would say that the programme probably presents Nicola Sturgeon in a slightly more sympathetic light than it does Alex Salmond. But there is this rivalry between them, and that I think is an important, if you like, psychological component to the fallout that subsequently takes place between them.
Of course, in terms of the fallout, there are a number of discrete issues. There's the issue of what is currently being probed by the police, and papers are at the Crown Office in terms of some of the SNP's internal financial issues. What happened to £600,000 that was raised for an independence campaign? There was the initial allegations at a Scottish government level about harassment allegations against Mr. Salmond, which the Scottish government probed, but of course the procedures, according to the Court of Session, were tainted by apparent bias. And then we had this sensational criminal trial where he faced multiple counts of harassment. Now, there are three different issues, but in a sense, this program is trying to look at it again through the eyes of the relationship between Mr. Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon. And let's take the first one. Which is the internal dynamics, because I think we can possibly say that one of the issues where there was tension in this relationship was that when Alex Salmond gave up the leadership of the SNP in 2014 after the independence referendum, he says to Nicola Sturgeon, who of course was married to the SNP chief executive Peter Murrell, this relationship won't work. You cannot have the First Minister and the party leader married to the chief executive. This will come back to haunt you. The optics of that kind of stuff doesn't look good. And both have very discrete roles to play. And of course, she says in the program, this advice was not welcome. And this, I suspect, played to the feeling that people around Nicola Sturgeon had, is that he is attempting to be a backseat driver. And I think that probably Nicola Sturgeon, as she said in the programme, had the First Minister been a male and the chief executive of the party been a female, she doubted that the request would have been made. But again, an interesting point about where the relationship could start to go wrong, because she may well have felt, I'm the number one, and I'm here under my own head of steam, and I'm here on the basis of my own ability, and I should be accorded the time and the space to manage the party in the movement the way in which you were afforded the time and the space to manage the party in the movement when you were leader.
Absolutely. And, I think, if you speak to SNP people who were at Westminster at the time, in the period 2015 to 2017, this isn't covered by the programme hugely, but, there is a clear sense from plenty of those people that actually Salmond caused Angus Robertson, who was leading the party at Westminster at that time, a lot of difficulties within the House of Commons and the management of the SNP group. And yes, you do have, there's a faint whiff of something sort of slightly patronizing that emanates from the Salmond camp on this, the suggestion that, I made Nicola. And so therefore she should have been grateful to me, and she should have, welcomed and sought out my advice. And obviously that didn't really happen. At the same time, I think it's also fair, indeed reasonable, to note that Salmond's concerns about too great a concentration of power in the one household, the Sturgeon moral axis, has been vindicated by subsequent events, and that Sturgeon should have had the, if you like, the capacity to see the bigger picture there. And perhaps her inability to do that was also we can trace back the threads and so on to some of the things that contributed to her own demise, her own political downfall, can be traced back to some of those limitations, if you like, and an inability to see how things would look to other people. And in that sense, a curious lack of empathy for people who don't already agree with her or share her views, who aren't already on board with Team Nicola. And so that sense of loyalty that you referred to earlier and so on, had to be sort of all-encompassing for the people around her as well. And many of those people, I think, definitely saw Salmond as some kind of a threat looming over Nicola's leadership. And their loyalties were very much to her, and to the party and to the independence movement, but to her first.
I think that Salmond's intervention pointing out the difficulties that could emerge with the chief executive of the party being married to the party leader were a reasonable one to make. I mean, I think actually they're a pretty obvious one to make. The issue, of course, is how it was done. And I have no idea how it was done. I don't know what tone was taken with this, or was it done in a quiet word in your ear, Nicola, you might want to consider, or was it done rather more stridently? I have absolutely no idea. What is perfectly clear is that the advice was not welcome. And that then leads us on to another meeting between the two, which is the genesis of the allegations against Alex Salmond, which are emerging at the level of the Scottish government, where he goes to a meeting in her house. Now, this of course was the subject of many exchanges in Parliament when we knew about this, quite rightly, I should say, appropriate for Parliament to quiz Nicola Sturgeon on all of this. So what we have here is allegations which are emerging. He, as the individual who's on the receiving end of these allegations, goes to a meeting with the First Minister, who at the end of the day would have to sign off on processes which are going to have to look at some of these allegations. Now, here again is where we come back to that first clip. Loyalty is almost everything, according to Alex Salmond. Was this a sort of off the record, non-attributable, nobody needs to know about this, we've been friends for many years, this is potentially very problematic for me, it's also potentially very problematic for you, can we discuss a way out of this? On the basis of personal friendship, on the basis of loyalty, Mr. Salmond may well have a reasonable expectation that as a friend, Nicola Sturgeon should listen to what he has to say. And as a friend, she may well feel compelled to listen to what he has to say. But as people made the point in Parliament at the time, if you're on the receiving end of allegations and you know that the First Minister at some point, in some fashion, is going to have to deal with these, not directly, but in signing off procedures which are going to be applied to you, the mere fact that you have the meeting at all in the first place compromises Nicola Sturgeon. And so here we have this conflict between loyalty almost being everything and the conflict between friendship and what is procedurally correct and not doing anything which compromises your successor. That must have been a pretty difficult meeting.
Undoubtedly, and further complicated, I would suggest, Bernard, by the fact that in what capacity was Nicola Sturgeon taking this meeting? Was she taking this meeting, indeed this whole process, as leader of the SNP or as First Minister of Scotland?
Doesn't matter.
And the answer to that, but the answer to that, I think, from people close to Sturgeon, was that sometimes she could be leader of the SNP and sometimes she could be First Minister of Scotland. She had two hats, and sometimes she would wear one and sometimes she would wear the other. Now, that is a Jesuitical distinction at the best of times,
Yes.
but very, very difficult in circumstances such as these. It seems to me quite clear that Salmond, on the one hand, clearly said, well, can't we go through some kind of mediation process and sort this out? And suggested to Nicola Sturgeon that she, try and facilitate that mediation process. But that's not something that she could compel. It's not something that was in her gift. But as First Minister as well, she had a duty, and this is what she would say, and people close to her support this view, obviously, that she couldn't sweep anything under the carpet, that, the complaints made by civil servants had to be addressed. And it would have been inappropriate for her as First Minister to get in the way or to have anything to do with either the investigation or the handling of those complaints. But I think the wider context of all of this, and is that there were people. These complaints first arose just after the sort of height of the Me Too movement, and I think that's quite significant because the atmosphere of politics at the time was, that you had politicians being held to account for past misdemeanors or alleged misdemeanors, some having to resign. Michael Fallon, remember, the defense secretary, had to resign as a result of past encounters that he'd had with women. And that's the context for it. And I think it's also reasonable to suppose that there were some people close to Nicola Sturgeon, I'm not saying it was her herself necessarily, but who saw this as an opportunity to mark out her as a serious and different kind of leader, very much in tune with the public mood or the gathering sensibility of the Me Too movement. And so it wasn't that they actively necessarily sought to destroy Alex Salmond, although that is what he would subsequently allege, but that they saw the potential political upside for Nicola Sturgeon in being seen to be distancing herself from her predecessor, who by now is not particularly popular in Scotland as a whole, still has his own clan, his own supporters, obviously, but is not widely popular with the public. And that Sturgeon can, if you like, use this as a means of showing what sort of leader she really is. And it'd be a leader that would, in certain respects, again, eclipse Alex Salmond. And that psychological problem, I think, has also contributed to the destruction of their relationship.
Yeah, and at this particular point, there is now a backstory emerging where Salmond is getting the view loyalty isn't everything in terms of his dealings with Nicola Sturgeon. Remember, he raises the issue of Peter Murrell, and that is creating tensions. He then raises the issue about trying to find a way out of these allegations. That is effectively rebuffed. That comes after he's lost his seat in 2017, in which he perhaps feels that the leadership that she offered at that election in part was responsible for his losing the Gordon constituency. So by this time, there is now a build-up of issues. But of course, even those build-up of issues is nothing as compared to the jaw-dropping events of January 2019, when these serious criminal allegations actually emerge. And here, in a sense, it all comes to a head. It all comes to a head. There's been background tension which has been building up over the years, but this all comes to a head. And people within the SNP are actually saying to themselves, what on earth is going on? There is a sense in which they simply cannot believe that there is this series of charges laid against Alex Salmond. Now, it's important to stress, in order that we are balanced here, and Kenny McCaskill, in a sense, is the most articulate advocate for Alex Salmond within episode 2. And we should actually say, and as somebody who's put together political documentaries in the past, this one, and I have no knowledge of this one appeared to me to be very heavily legaled. Very heavily legaled, because there was no jaw-dropping moment actually within episode 2. After episode 1, I was sort of looking for, where's the big revelation going to come? It didn't come. It was just a narration, by and large, of what we already know. But one of the things which would perhaps explain the difference in emotions displayed between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond is the point that, and there were archive clips of Kenny McCaskill, they believe that there was effectively a conspiracy to do down Mr. Salmond for political reasons. That is what they believe. And the problem is that from the point of view of this program, they cannot, if you like, put into the public domain their evidence, because there are certain issues which are still live. So there is a sense in which Salmond is doing this interview, but he's doing the interview where he can't do it within the context of full disclosure because of current legal issues. But here we have it in a sense. Nicola Sturgeon's view of this is that there are allegations. I have to be seen to be taking these seriously. There are separate criminal allegations. I'm completely horrified by them, but the system has to take its course. And supporters of Alex Salmond privately, absolutely incandescent, that they effectively think that he's being fitted up. And what we didn't get from the program, and we're never going to get for legal reasons, is there anything in this? Is there anything in that allegation? We might get the answer to that eventually, but it's probably still some time away.
Absolutely, and I should stress that although we haven't run this podcast past lawyers yet, I'm going to be very careful with what we say here for all the obvious reasons. There are matters that one of the difficulties with this whole affair is that there are legal restrictions that make it very difficult to comment on aspects of what has happened. And plenty of people inside the political bubble know things that they cannot say in public because of those legal restrictions, although public understanding of the case would be greatly enhanced if those details could be made public. So that is a limitation with which the program makers obviously struggled, and to which there is no good answer, frankly. But the accusation made by Salmond and his supporters is that he was, that he was essentially framed, that there was a sort of fishing expedition to concoct charges against him, and so on, are very, very explosive allegations. And we should stress once again, as people do know, but it is important to stress again, that he was acquitted on all counts against him. But the destruction of their relationship is, at that point there is no turning back. But the seeds of that destruction had been there for some time. One of the parts in episode 2 that demonstrates this with quite a bit of clarity, is when Salmond, who is looking for something to do after he is no longer an MP, and as Nicola Sturgeon is not seeking his counsel and so on, well, what am I going to do? So he decides, well, I'd like to actually host a TV chat show, basically. And then the question is, well, who's going to host it? Who's going to broadcast it? And he alights on RT, formerly known as Russia Today, generally considered to be the Kremlin's propaganda TV station. And he doesn't give Nicola Sturgeon a heads up about this. She finds out about it at the same time everybody else does. And there's an enormous amount of what on earth is he doing? amidst this, across the SNP, really. He didn't have to do this. It's something that looked bad, I think, at the time, and that is the general view at the time. It looks even worse, obviously, after Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, or second invasion of the Ukraine, technically, because, of course, it's already done so in 2014. But this is a much bigger, full-scale invasion. And Salmond's judgment then looks awry. And he sees that, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing. Why are people upset about this? He doesn't really understand it. And you see this sort of gulf that opens up between them. And Sturgeon's people, I think, would say, well, look, Alec doesn't think that he needs to be accountable for any of his actions. And he would say, well, why should I be accountable for things when I haven't done anything wrong?
Yeah, and why should I be accountable when I'm out of Parliament at this particular time? Nicola Sturgeon learned about the Russia Today programme when she was at a meeting of the British-Irish Council, and she recounts that Leo Varadkar had said to the Irish Taoiseach, had said to her, "This is a joke, right? This is a joke. This can't be right." And as Nicola Sturgeon tells the programme, she's simply thinking, what are you thinking? And I paraphrase here because I wasn't taking down a contemporaneous note, but she basically tells the programme that managing his ego was a problem that landed on my desk. And I thought that was pretty telling, because at that point, clearly, I think the relationship was in trouble, and that, of course, is before we get to some of the more explosive allegations which then subsequently emerged. If I was looking for a newsline within the second episode, and although the series is incredibly engaging and it's put together in a very skillful way, it is part political narrative and it is part docu-soap. It has an almost soap opera type quality in terms of the falling out of these two significant political figures. Journalists are always saying, what's the top line? What do I run as my top line? And I think the top line of the programme was given by the former First Minister, Humza Yousaf, because a lot of time is spent listening to people talking about Alex Salmond's modus operandi as a leader. Just how tough a taskmaster was he? Just how often did he let rip? And I will put it in these terms. I've come across a lot of senior politicians, of which Alex Salmond is just one, who are driven people, who are incredibly demanding of civil servants, demanding of the people who work for them. Civil servants in days gone past used to tremble in the company of one Michael Forsyth. Gordon Brown's temper tantrums in Whitehall were absolutely legendary. What is absolutely clear is that if you apply the principles of good practice from a human resources department in a normal workplace or any workplace, and you apply them to a lot of senior politicians will absolutely fall foul of an HR department's harassment and bullying policy. I have absolutely no doubt about that in relation to lots of politicians over the years. And therefore, if you recall that when Alex Salmond did that interview at the Champney Inn after the serious allegations emerged, he stuck to a form of words. I'm effectively, again, I slightly paraphrase, I am no saint. I've done things of which I'm not proud, but I have not sexually harassed or assaulted anyone. I am not guilty of criminal behavior, not guilty of criminal behavior, which then begs the question, but what about non-criminal behavior, which is just a bit off? And Humza Yousaf in the programme says that when you're the First Minister and when you're in the room, you're the most important person in that room. And therefore, there is a power dynamic at play when you are meeting people who are subordinate to you. And given the allegations that were made, it was the view of Humza Yusuf that Alex Salmond was guilty of an abuse of power.
Absolutely. And I think that is now the consensus view amongst the SNP. Of course, circumstances have changed now that Alex Salmond leads a rival political party. He is no longer a member of the SNP. He's no longer part of the family. He has been exiled from the family. Now, plenty of people in the SNP would say that Alex Salmond has chosen exile himself, and that the party can't be associated with him. And there is this sort of sense of, when you look at the 2 hours of this program, which I agree is put together splendidly and with great finesse, there is a sense in which Salmond essentially has very few regrets. He says, well, things happened. The cards fell the way they fell. I don't regret that I made. Well, he will say, I regret the destruction of my relationship with Nicola Sturgeon, but fundamentally, it's her fault, not mine. She is much more emotional about it, because, for 20 years he was her leader, her mentor, the person who in some ways helped facilitate or even create her career. And you get a sense too from Salmond again and again and again in the program that she should have remembered that he had made her. And then, so that is what makes what he terms her subsequent betrayal of him all the more piquant and galling and wounding. And again, it's very difficult to get away from the sense that this is a sense of ego really is behind a lot of the destruction of the relationship, and the impact that destruction has had on the SNP, I think, has been very profound. There are other things that have contributed to the party's declining electoral performance, but I think you can trace quite a lot of the difficulties back to the Salmond Sturgeon affair. That it is not something that can be isolated or insulated from everything else that has subsequently happened to the SNP.
Yeah, and it gets back to, and it's a very, very good clip that the program makers used right at the head of episode 2. Loyalty is almost everything. And in a sense, the whole of episode 2 is teasing out to what extent loyalty is almost everything, because Alex Salmond is judging many of these events by the dictum that loyalty is almost everything. And Nicola Sturgeon's view appears to be, loyalty, friendship, but there are certain things which are to do with process where loyalty can compromise what it is right for me to do as party leader, right for me to do in the execution of the office of First Minister. And when it comes to that, loyalty has to be relegated to what she believed was the right thing to do. But what are you left with at the end of the day? You're left with a sense that certainly for people within the SNP, this is utterly tragic because it has fractured the Yes movement and the Yes family, and certainly people who now coalesce around Alex Salmond are scathing about Nicola Sturgeon's leadership. And although these tensions are not things that the public pick up within the sort of political hothouse of the political village, they still play out to this day. But, perhaps all great political friendships, relationships end in divorce. Blair and Brown, after all, created the electoral juggernaut that was New Labour. And as we now know, non-communication was the standard relationship between 10 and 11 for many, many years during the New Labour period of government. So it's a skilled program at charting the end of this relationship. But I come back to a point. It's not the final word. It can't be the final word. It's not the final word because there are still legal issues ongoing. And I'm going to give a little bit of advice to Firecrest Films, who've done a splendid job. You should be charting what's going to be happening in the course of the next year or two, because there's an episode 3. There is an episode 3, and the conclusion from episode 3 could make very uncomfortable viewing for one of these two protagonists.
Or quite possibly for both of them.
For both of them.
But you're right. I mean, even if you're not naturally sympathetic to the SNP, the human aspect of this extraordinary saga is tinged with a degree of sadness, actually, because you have two people of considerable political gifts and ability. And in the end, they are consumed by forces that are not necessarily entirely within their control. But those forces also end up dominating, crowding out normal politics to a great extent. And so from the perspective of the country as a whole, you begin to wonder if this sort of SNP psychodrama, this soap opera, as you termed it, Bernard, correctly, I think, what impact did that have on the governance of Scotland? What are the things that did not get done that could have been done because so much attention, both emotional and intellectual, was being devoted to the fallout of the relationship between Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon? And that, again, is something that perhaps an episode 3 could address at some point in the future.
Excellent. I think that's been a pretty good run at that, Alex. Yeah, let's know what you make of the programme. It was interesting. Share your thoughts on email, ponsonbymassey@gmail.com, at ponsonbymassey on X. It will certainly get the political village talking. But that's it from this episode of the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. From me, it's goodbye.
And surprisingly enough, it's goodbye from me as well.